Well, pensioners are having their homes taken off them. Young people are being plunged into massive debt if they want an education. Disabled and the elderly are having their daycare centres closed. Around a quarter of families are lacking a decent state of living, we hear this week. And thousands of those are having to turn to food banks now to feed their children. It's not as if the money's not there. It's in the hands of the 1%, many who pay no tax at all. In a scandal that's only now unfolding, many BBC government employees are paid as a company as well. Where that company is based is in a tax haven. They pay no income tax. On BBC Question Time recently, the Lord Chancellor and Bilderberger, Kenneth Clarke, blushed red as he explained tax havens must be closed. So did he really mean it? Well, it's an old story, but brought into sharp focus when the rest of us, even those with a job, can't make ends meet. John Christensen directs the International Secretariat of the Tax Justice Network, a research-led global coalition of experts and activists. He trained as an auditor and an economist and has worked in many countries around the world, including in secrecy jurisdictions, which I'm sure he'll tell us about, where he worked in offshore financial services with Touche Ross & Co. For 11 years, he was economic advisor to the government of the British Channel Island of Jersey. In the past 10 years, he's become what The Guardian has described as the unlikely figurehead of a worldwide campaign against tax avoidance. Well, hi, John, and welcome to Drive Time.
Well, hello, Tony.
First of all, can you just tell us whereabouts are the biggest tax havens?
Well, many people think the tax havens are sitting in the Caribbean or little islands in the Channel or Gibraltar, places like this. The really big tax havens are countries like United States, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and would you believe United Kingdom? These are the really big players in this game. Most of them are powerful countries who have political connections. In the case of the United Kingdom, for example, we're closely connected to the Channel Islands, to the Cayman Islands, to Bermuda. And all of these tiny little islands, which people think of when they think of tax havens, are part of the British spiderweb, as we call it, of tax havens that feed money into the City of London. So we're talking about very big and very powerful countries, which for many years, for decades in fact, have been protecting tax havens, supporting them, blocking global attempts to clamp down on them. And when we hear senior politicians talk in London about wanting to close down, I think we should take it with a very, very big pinch of salt, because they have no intention of doing anything about these places.
So you're saying that Kenneth Clarke didn't really mean what he said then, when he says, we really must do something about this, on Question Time the other week?
Well, I heard people talking in the 1970s about we must do something about tax havens. I heard the same in the 1980s, the 1990s. 3 years ago, the Prime Minister talked at the G20, and in the Senate in Washington, he stood up and said, the time has come to close down the tax havens. And do you know what? Time and time again, Britain takes the lead in blocking attempts to close down tax havens. So, no, I'm afraid I don't believe politicians when they say this.
Now, once upon a time, you weren't actually able to just ship large, vast amounts of money abroad. When did that all change? Is there any point that you can say, well, it was the whole sort of tax haven boom started at a certain time, in the 70s or something?
Well, that's right. Back in from the 1940s onwards, after the war, a new settlement was put into place. It was called the Bretton Woods Settlement, with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund there. And what they did was they made it very hard indeed for people to export capital from one country to another, because they recognized quite rightly that capital moving around from one place to another can be very destabilizing and encourages tax evasion. So they put into place a whole apparatus around the world. But it didn't stop people, but it certainly brought the tax evasion down to a very low level. It all started going wrong, I think, in the early 1970s when President Nixon, under huge pressure because of the Vietnam War, he was under pressure to protect the dollar, and he started to allow American banks and others to shift and start operating in London in a pretty unregulated market called the Eurobond market. And at that stage, the whole tax haven thing began to really pick up big time from the 1970s onwards. And it was a key part of Mrs. Thatcher's development strategy for this country to deregulate London in order to attract these huge illicit financial flows from other countries.
But that's one thing to say, you want to attract money in, but, surely that's not the same thing as saying, well, people should be able to ship all their money out of the country.
Well, the trouble is we've never been too fussy. We're not too fussy about what money comes in, and we're not particularly fussy about how our own elites shift their affairs offshore into Luxembourg and Switzerland and so on. And if you want evidence for, the way in which the British government talks the talk of tackling tax evasion but doesn't actually walk it, the truth of the matter is this year they've negotiated a new deal with Switzerland to protect British tax evaders using Switzerland. And we know the scale of money involved runs to many billions of pounds, but British government isn't prepared to take active steps to close it all down, mainly because the people who use offshore accounts in Switzerland are engaged in tax evading in Switzerland and places like Jersey are, let's be honest, very closely connected to the political elites and the business elites that shaped policy in London.
Now, I can remember a couple of years ago, a plucky banker, at least he was working in a bank, Rudolf Elmer, he actually got a whole bunch of tax evaders on a on a CD drive and copied it, and he took it to WikiLeaks. And if I remember rightly, he was actually arrested for his trouble. Now, the idea here was he was trying to expose the names of people and also the amounts that were being kept secretly in these Swiss bank accounts. So what do you know about his case?
Well, that's right. I was, in fact, with Rudy when he handed the CDs across to Julian Assange from WikiLeaks. Rudy is, in many respects, he's a really heroic guy. He's just an ordinary bank manager. He was working for a Swiss bank, and he was sent to work in the Cayman Islands, which is a British tax haven in the Caribbean. And what he discovered when he turned up at that branch was hair-raising. He discovered that there were very weak compliance. Most of the clients involved in this Cayman Island branch were involved in tax evasion. So he started saying to his board back in Switzerland, look, we've got a lot of problems here. We've got to sort this out. And instead of saying, we'll support you, the bank said, we don't want to know about this. It's not your job to sort it out. You just do your job and carry on. And he persisted, and they refused to take action. And eventually he said, enough's enough. I'm walking out on this one. If you aren't prepared to take action, we're sitting here on a lot of criminal accounts and criminal clients. I'm going to go public, which is what he did. What happened next is really ugly because not only did the bank start to attack him and his family, but he found that the Swiss government didn't support him. In fact, they started to harass him, and eventually they arrested him and put him into jail. And it was only because we started to kick up a fuss in the international press and embarrass the Swiss government that they backed down a bit. But he still hasn't got a job, and he's still being harassed. So it's a very ugly situation.
Yes, it's pretty awful when there's no protection for whistleblowers. But ultimately, how big is this whole tax haven economy? Have you any idea?
Well, look, first of all, the tax haven economy is on a massive scale. It's so big that I would say now we've got to think about it as being a huge part of the global economy. Here's some estimates. There are no official statistics, and I would say one of the strangest things about the whole tax haven economy is that there are no official statistics. But here are some reasonably good figures. We know that at least half of world trade is passed on paper through tax havens in order for big companies to evade and avoid tax. Half of world trade goes on paper. We know that almost all cross-border investment goes through tax havens, again, in order to evade and avoid tax. The amount of private wealth held offshore in tax havens. Now take a deep breath because first of all you have to understand what a trillion is here. A trillion is 1 million or 100 billion. So the sums we're talking about here are massive. The amount of wealth held offshore in tax havens evading tax is well over 20 trillion US dollars. Well, that's a global figure. We're talking massive sums. In terms of the United Kingdom, we think that the best estimate I've seen suggests that the United Kingdom loses at least £18 billion every year from tax evasion through tax havens. So
well, I suppose
this affects us all because it means that our schools are being cut back, our education services are being cut back, our health services are being cut back because the government won't tackle this issue.
Well, I suppose the obvious question is exactly that. Why? I mean, it seems to make sense to say, no, you can't do this anymore. Why don't the government say, no, you can't, and then they can collect all of that wealth and skim it off in taxation?
Okay, this is a really huge question. And look, I've been studying this for 35 years, and as you said earlier on, I actually went offshore to work in the tax havens to find out how they operate. And ended up being economic advisor to the government of Jersey for 11 years. And what I discovered there was, the reason why the UK government and other governments won't take action is because our elites use tax havens so extensively. The rich people in Britain, the powerful companies that use Britain, use tax havens right the way across the board. And of course, they're not going to vote like turkeys. They're not going to vote for Christmas. They will not take action against tax havens. In fact, I've been an observer to the United Nations committee that's trying to tackle this for over a decade now, and I've watched how British government officials block attempts to tackle tax havens. I've seen exactly the same happening within the European Union. It is typically Britain working with places like Luxembourg and Austria that lead attempts to block progress to tackle tax havens. So we, the British public, are victims of a tax haven culture. Our rich elites and our powerful elites protect that very culture for their own reasons.
But how does this actually affect the rest of us? How does it affect ordinary people here in Britain?
Well, it affects us not only because we're losing a great deal of tax revenue, which means that our public services are being cut.
Have you any idea, John? Can you put a rough ballpark figure on, how much we are losing?
Well, as I said earlier, the best estimate I've seen, and this comes from a company that specialises in this kind of research, is that we lose $18 billion a year to tax avoidance, tax evasion through tax havens. That's only part of the equation because tax avoidance and tax evasion also happens here domestically in Britain. So the overall tax losses from tax evasion amount to $70 billion a year. And tax avoidance costs us about $25 billion a year. So the sums involved are absolutely massive. And the trouble is that the government really isn't serious about wanting to tackle this, because if it was serious, it would recruit more people into revenue and customs to start clamping down on this.
In fact, it's doing the opposite, isn't it?
It's done exactly the opposite, and that's the issue. And they say, well, we're adding staff. They're not adding staff. They are, in fact, cutting staff from revenue and customs. So the situation is likely to deteriorate. What does it mean for ordinary people? It means that ordinary people in Britain actually end up paying more tax because, whilst rich people are avoiding and evading taxes on a massive scale, the government responds to that by increasing VAT and increasing other types of taxes and cutting our tax allowances because they're not prepared to tackle the tax evasion and tax avoidance. That means that all of us end up suffering in two ways. We end up paying more tax, but we also lose the public services. So it's really having a dramatic effect upon all of us individually.
Now, you seem to be almost implying that these tax havens have had quite a major role to play in the financial crisis.
Yeah, yes, they have played an extraordinary part in the financial crisis, and they continue to play an extraordinary part in the financial crisis. But what I think listeners need to understand, and this is very hard for ordinary people to understand, is that tax havens are not just about tax evasion. They're also places where banks and hedge funds and what are called shadow banks operate, and they operate in places like Jersey and the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg because of the weak regulation they can achieve over there. In fact, in most cases there's no regulation in these places, so they can get away with doing whatever they want. And this means that if we talk about what happened in 2007, 2008, when the banks tripped up over collateralized debt obligations and the mortgage markets, one of the reasons why financial services authorities and other regulators hadn't realized what was going on was because a lot of these special financial instruments the collateralized debt obligations, were actually prepared and issued offshore in Dublin, in Jersey, in Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands. And no one was actually regulating what was going on. In fact, very few people were aware of what was going on. So when it happened, it came as a surprise because they hadn't been assessing and understanding the risks that were building up in the banking sector. And that was because there's this kind of constant game of pass the parcel, from one regulator to another. The banks were hiding these things offshore in a shadow banking system, and the regulators were saying, well, that's not actually our area of jurisdiction, so we can't regulate there. And they were assuming the people in Dublin were doing that, which they weren't.
That sounds like a kind of crisis of regulation again. Can you just flesh out a little bit what you mean by a shadow banking system? That sounds almost spooky.
Well, it is pretty spooky, to be honest. Look, the banks, over the course of the last few decades, have been using shadow banks. These are unregulated banks, typically offshore, for a lot of their activities. In fact, they account for a huge proportion of banking activities, and they like to do this offshore precisely because they're unregulated. And because they're unregulated, they are more profitable. So banks have been operating out of shadow banks. Technically, they're called structured investment vehicles, but because they can get away with in an unregulated environment, a very profitable and therefore attractive environment for them. They do it in the tax havens precisely because they don't have to pay tax on the extraordinary profits they gain from working in this shadow banking system. So you have a combination of tax avoidance, lax regulation. It's all very attractive to the banks, so they use tax havens extensively for this. And the British regulators, by and large, paid no attention to it whatsoever.
Now, I'm trying to find a little bit of something positive in here. I mean, many of these tax havens are actually British, that is to say, the old colonies, this kind of thing. Have they actually benefited the British economy in any way? Because those tax havens are British ex-British places. Well,
the story they spin, and Jersey is exactly what you say. It's a crown dependency. It's been closely associated with the crown since 1066, when the Duke of Normandy invaded Britain. And Jersey's very close to the City of London. Its financial centre is a satellite of the City of London. And what they boast is, well, we're actually really good for Britain because we pass hundreds of billions of capital from other countries through to the City of London. And that appears to be really good for the UK economy until you start thinking about how that money is invested. This money, by and large, isn't invested in creating new jobs in Britain. By and large, it's invested in buying houses in London, expensive flats in London. It's invested in, it goes into the equity markets, but not to invest in new businesses, but to pump up the share prices of existing businesses. So I think that when you stand back and look at all these massive capital inflows into Britain, they're not nearly as useful for the economy as we'd like them to be. In fact, I think there's clear evidence that they create property market bubbles in the southeast of England. They jack up equity prices on the markets here, and there's very little evidence that they actually have a positive outcome in terms of creating new jobs, new business, new research and development in the United Kingdom.
Okay, now what about, what can we do to actually take action against the tax havens, given that the politicians are sort of captured by the super rich and they aren't going to get their finger out?
Well, that's right. I think it's absolutely right to talk about politicians being captured in this country, and that applies across most of the parties. I think, first of all, it's helpful to recognise that there is a problem, and I think now people are recognising that there's a problem, and it's a global problem. It affects most ordinary people across the world. I think it's important that we in Britain recognise that not only are most of us victims of this tax haven economy, but also that Britain is a major global problem because so many of the tax havens are so closely linked to Britain. You look across the tax havens of the world, and almost half of them have the Queen's head on their stamp, or fly some kind of union flag, or are closely associated with the Commonwealth. So Britain is clearly a major player here. And as I said earlier, Britain is also blocking international attempts, both by the European Union and by the United Nations and by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, to close down on tax havens. So I think that what we all need to do is to start putting pressure upon our politicians. We need to write to our politicians. We need to stand up to our politicians and say, what are you doing to tackle tax havens? We demand now that you take action, real action. None of it is difficult. It all involves simple measures to improve international cooperation between tax authorities and to improve the transparency of companies. None of it's rocket science. It can all be done very quickly. The British government has been blocking it for many years. We now must put pressure upon our politicians to take action.
Okay, given that, I mean, it's nice to know, to get a bit of a focus, but what specific measures would need to be taken to close down the tax haven economy?
Right. Well, the first measure, and this would have a dramatic effect upon the tax haven economy, would be to adopt what's called automatic information exchange. Now, this is quite simple, really. If I, resident here in England, if I opened a bank account in a tax haven, in a branch in a tax haven, the branch in the tax haven would have to automatically inform the authorities in the tax haven that I, resident in England, have opened that account, and the authorities in the tax haven would automatically have to share that information under treaty arrangements with HM Revenue and Customs here in Britain. And just having that information that I've got that bank account would be enough to trigger their awareness that I've got that account, and if I start evading and not declaring the income on that account, then they would know. But anyway, there would be a constant flow of information about the income being paid on that account. That would be quite enough to close down a lot of personal tax evasion in this country and around the world. And that's the standard which the European Union already operates, and which we're trying to have extended to cover all countries and all tax havens around the world. So that's one measure, and Britain should now stop blocking attempts by the European Union to implement that effectively, and if they did that, we'd very quickly cut back on a lot of tax evasion. Another measure would be to cut back on tax evasion and avoidance by multinational companies, simply by requiring them to adopt an international financial reporting standard to disclose their accounts for every country and every jurisdiction where they operate around the world. And that would help us to identify, and help tax authorities to identify where they're using tax havens to shift their profits out of the countries where they generate the profits into tax havens. Simple measures, nothing complicated about them, nothing very expensive about them, but this would do a great deal to improve international cooperation and tackle the tax havens.
Okay, John, the introduction to the second hour, I talked about a particular, rather bizarre bit of news this week, that the Tetra Pak billionaire Ava Rousing, she kept much of her wealth offshore and as part of a cabin apartment which she'd bought on a cruise ship called The World. Now, this is a new one on me, the idea that you buy an apartment on a cruise ship and you can sort of hop in and hop out when you feel like it, but that is actually being used as a tax avoidance mechanism. That's right. I mean, The World is a particularly bizarre thing, and I would encourage listeners to kind of Google The World and have a look at this extraordinary thing, which, from what I understand, is a really unpleasant place, because one of the sad things about very rich people is they're very selfish and self-absorbed. So you've got a huge collection of selfish and self-absorbed and rather greedy people on this ship, and from what I've heard, it's a really unpleasant atmosphere. In fact, that's been well covered in the Italian press. But I mean, in the case of Rousing, of course, that family, originally from Scandinavia, came to Britain, lived in London precisely because London is an offshore tax haven, and they have non-domiciled status here in Britain, which means they only pay tax on a very small proportion of their global income. As long as they keep their income outside England, they don't pay tax on it. And this is another part of tax haven Britain, which is why so many oligarchs from around the world move to London, because they're largely
living here, taking advantage of all the fantastic facilities that we provide here in London and in England, but they're not paying tax towards it. And this is a very unsatisfactory part of Britain's tax haven status.
Finally, John, we hear this week that the BBC is having to defend the fact that it is paying its employees as companies, and that many of those companies are actually offshore and abroad, as well as civil servants. This is a sort of breaking story that I think brought out by XRO News, the news agency in London, over the last few weeks. Do you think there may be some movement on that? Because it seems that some of our taxpayers' money is going straight, rather than people paying PAYE, is going straight into companies in tax havens, and this is being used as a tax avoidance measure.
Well, that's absolutely correct, and I hope that the government will now take strong measures. It is unacceptable for a public broadcasting organisation to pay its senior staff in this way. It's unacceptable for anyone, frankly, to use tax havens for tax avoidance. I know they always say, look, what we're doing is perfectly legal, but I think what ordinary people have to understand is the tax codes in this country, and in most countries, are largely shaped to meet the interests of tax avoiders and the people who use tax havens. They spend a lot of money lobbying government to have these loopholes built into the tax codes. And they moan all the time about how complex tax arrangements are, but they love that complexity, because the more complexity that there is, the more opportunity there is for their lawyers to identify loopholes and exploit them. So I hope the government is going to take very strong measures. The BBC should take strong measures now to close this down entirely. There's a simple word for this. They like to say it's tax avoidance. I'm afraid it's cheating. It's cheating all ordinary people in this country, and it's time to close it down. But also, Tony, whilst we're talking about them, the issue has become very hot in America this week, because Vanity Fair, which is a hugely important magazine in America and around the world, has run a big story in this latest edition about how Mitt Romney, who is one of the candidates for the election opposing President Obama, has been using the Cayman Islands for his own affairs. And this story is pointing the spotlight on a presidential candidate in the United States, saying, well, what are you doing here? Why won't you disclose your tax affairs? Because is it right that a presidential candidate for the United States doesn't actually pay tax on his wealth in the United States? So this issue is becoming very, very hot, not only here in Britain, but also in the United States.
OK, watch this space. John Christensen from the Tax Justice Network, thanks ever so much for joining us on Drive Time this evening.
Pleasure. Thanks, Tony.
Drive Time on BCFM, 5 till 7 on 93.2 FM.